The Oval Office was silent, save for the faint hum of the cameras and the shuffling of papers. President Donald Trump sat at the resolute desk, flanked by advisors who looked as though they were holding their breaths. Behind the scenes, the strategy was clear: keep everything scripted. Trump was his own best weapon and worst liability, and when questions from reporters rolled in, it was always a gamble which version of him they'd get. The press conference had begun predictably. Trump launched into the teleprompter speech with his signature delivery, accentuating phrases like strongest economy in the history of the world and unmatched leadership. His advisors watched nervously from the sidelines, counting down the minutes to the planned conclusion. But nothing ever went as planned. When the scripted remarks ended, the usual reporters began lobbing predictable questions. Mr. President, does your administration intend to double down on tariffs against China? Can you give us an update on the border wall construction? Easy, rehearsed answers. The advisors relaxed just slightly. Then, out of nowhere, the reporter from Fox News, a network that had historically thrown the president an endless stream of softball questions, did the unthinkable. Susan Grant, known for towing the line, stood up and broke the script. Mr. President, she began, her voice steady but sharp, what are your thoughts on Jim Cramer's report this morning about the bond market death spiral? He said the last issuance of Treasury bonds only sold 3%. Are you concerned about the U.S. losing its foothold in global finance? The room froze. Trump blinked, his usual bravado momentarily punctured. For a brief second, it seemed as though he might ask her to repeat herself. His advisors exchanged alarmed glances, whispering urgently to one another. In all their preparation, no one had considered that even Fox might go rogue. Trump leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk, and did what he always did when faced with a thorny question. He improvised.
Well, Jim Cramer doesn't know what he's talking about, okay? Bonds are great. Tremendous, actually. Everyone loves them. People are lining up to buy them. Lining up, Susan. No problem at all.
But the nervous expressions behind him told a different story. The issue was real, and it was catastrophic. Since Trump's trade war had escalated and April's financial meltdown had wiped out $15 trillion from global markets, investors worldwide had grown skittish about U.S. debt. Treasury bonds, once the safest and most in-demand financial products, were now seen as toxic. What Trump didn't know, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that this was no ordinary market reaction. The chaos had been deliberately executed. Mark Carney, a skilled economist and freshly minted interim Prime Minister of Canada, had been quietly working behind the scenes, traveling globally to orchestrate a financial counterstrike against Trump's policies. Through deft diplomacy and a network of trusted intermediaries, Carney persuaded world leaders to act in concert, slowly but systematically offloading their U.S. bond holdings and pressuring investors to abandon the dollar. The result? A catastrophic sell-off that forced the U.S. Treasury to raise bond yields to unsustainable levels, a move that weakened the dollar further. As yields climbed, money flowed out of American assets, leaving the U.S. isolated economically, its financial cornerstone cracking under the strain. In effect, Carney had weaponized global alliances against Trump's hubris, creating a spiraling financial doom loop. Back in the Oval Office, Trump continued to dismiss the question with vague superlatives and a pivot to his usual talking points.
We've got a very, very strong economy. Everyone knows it. Best recovery in history, despite what these so-called experts say.
But the damage was done. The room buzzed with murmurs as reporters exchanged sharp glances and advisors scrambled to form contingency plans behind the scenes. The bond market was crumbling, and now the world knew it. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Mark Carney watched the press conference from his office. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face as Trump stumbled. His plan was working, but this was only the beginning. The dollar would soon face a reckoning it might not recover from, and the world, for better or worse, was about to be reshaped. The orchestrated sell-off had begun to force the U.S. Treasury to raise bond yields to unsustainable levels, further weakening the dollar. As yields climbed, money flowed out of American assets, leaving the U.S. isolated economically, its financial cornerstone cracking under the strain. In effect, Carney had weaponized global alliances against Trump's hubris, creating a spiraling financial doom loop.